After my divorce at 73, my ex-husband smiled, sure I had nothing left. Then a lawyer arrived. Your first husband from the 1970s left you $47 million, but there's a condition. The morning Franklin told me to leave, he didn't even put down his coffee cup. That's the part I keep coming back to. 38 years. 38 years of cooking his meals, balancing his books, ironing his shirts so the collars lay flat the way he liked. 38 years of making myself a little smaller every time he needed more room. And when the moment came to end all of it, he couldn't be bothered to set down his mug. He just looked at me across the breakfast table on a Thursday morning in April and said he wanted a divorce. The same tone he'd used to say he wanted different curtains. Casual, final, like he was returning something that hadn't fit right. I was 73 years old. I had $12 in my coat pocket and one suitcase when I sat down on a park bench outside the Harrove County Public Library in Monroe, Georgia, 7 months later, watching pigeons pick at breadcrumbs on cold pavement, wondering if this was where 38 years of loyalty landed a woman. I didn't know then that I was about to find out my entire life had been built on a lie. And I didn't know that the man who'd told me to leave was going to watch what happened next from a very safe, very small distance. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you how all of this came apart and then somehow came back together. My name is Evelyn Rose Mercer. Most people who knew me young called me Evie. I was born in Monroe, Georgia in 1950, the middle daughter of a postal worker and a school teacher who taught me, among other things, that a woman holds herself together with whatever she has available. I was 22 years old when I married Thomas Earl Grady in the summer of 1972. He was a soft-spoken, steady man who hummed while he did the dishes and made me a birthday cake from scratch every single year, even the years we couldn't really afford the flour. We were young and broke and happy in the specific way that people are happy when they don't yet know how quickly things can change. 3 years in, things changed. On a Saturday afternoon in the spring of 1975, I was told that Thomas's heart had simply stopped. He was 31 years old. No warning, just gone. There one day, absent the next. I had a 2-year-old son named Marcus and $11 in savings and a grief so large I could not find the edges of it. I did what my mother had taught me. I held myself together with whatever I had. I worked as a seamstress at a dry cleaning shop on the east side of Monroe for 11 years. I raised Marcus alone. I visited Thomas's grave 6 times over the years, placing flowers, talking to him the way you talk to someone when you cannot bear the silence they left behind. I met Franklin Mercer at a church fundraiser dinner in the fall of 1984. I was 46. He was tall, with a wide smile, and a very good handshake. He owned a hardware business and seemed, at the time, like the kind of man who would always show up. For a long time, he did. We built a comfortable life on Burwood Drive. Franklin's hardware store did well through the late 80s and 90s. I kept his books on weekends and managed the house during the week. We went to church every Sunday. We had barbecues in the summer. We drove to see his sister in Tallahassee every December. It was ordinary. I had learned by then not to take ordinary for granted. What I had not understood, what I would not understand until it was much too late, was that Franklin had always kept a part of himself that belonged only to himself. Not mysterious, just closed off. He handled all the money, all the accounts, all the bills. And I, having been raised in a time when a woman trusted her husband with such things, having been broken open once already by loss, had let him. Had been grateful even that someone wanted to carry the weight. The house was in his name alone. I never thought to question it. The divorce took 7 months and left me with almost nothing. A small settlement payment, enough for 4, maybe 5 months of careful living, and whatever personal things I'd brought into the marriage. My sewing machine, my mother's quilt, Marcus's baby photographs. Franklin kept the house, the car, the savings account, with 32 years of accumulated value in it. By late November, I had burned through what little money I had on a motel room at the edge of town. When that ran out, I had nowhere to go. Marcus offered immediately. He always offers immediately, that boy, but he had a small Atlanta apartment, 2 young children, and a long commute. I was not going to walk into my son's life and take the air out of it. So I slept at the women's shelter on Clement Street, and I sat on a park bench outside the public library most mornings, using their bathroom and their warmth during the day, and I read donated paperback novels, and I watched the pigeons, and I tried to think clearly about what came next. And then I heard what Franklin had said about me at the neighborhood block meeting. Our neighbor Louise told me carefully, watching my face. Franklin had been asked by someone at the meeting whether Evelyn was going to be all right. And Franklin, who had lived in my house, eaten my food, leaned on my steadiness for 38 years, had waved his hand like brushing away a fly and said, "Evelyn will be fine. Women like her always land somewhere. Nobody's going to lose sleep over a woman that old. She's had her time. Nobody needs you at your age." That was what he meant. He didn't even have the honesty to say it directly. He just packaged it in a shrug and handed it out to the neighbors like it was a polite remark. I held those words for a long time, the way you hold something very hot long enough to truly understand the burn, and then I set them down in a place inside me where they could not make me collapse. I needed to stay clear. I needed to think. The Tuesday morning Albert Good found me. The air was sharp and the sky was pale gray, and I was 40 pages into a donated Patricia Cornwell novel that I'd already read once before. He came and stood a few feet away, wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather document bag, looking at me with careful, not unkind eyes. He was around 55. He had the measured posture of someone who had delivered difficult news before and understood that the delivery mattered. He said, "Excuse me, are you Mrs. Evelyn Rose Mercer?" I I looked up and said I was. He sat down at the far end of the bench, not crowding me, I noticed that, and introduced himself as Albert Good, probate attorney from Nashville, Tennessee. He said he had been looking for me for nearly 3 months. I stared at him. He folded his hands on top of his document bag and said, "Ma'am, I need to tell you something important, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." I nodded. "Your first husband, Thomas Earl Grady, passed away last month." The ground shifted. "Thomas died in 1975, I said. Albert Good shook his head slowly. "He did not," he said. "Thomas Earl Grady survived. He left Monroe in the spring of 1975. His death was never formally recorded. He passed away on November 3rd of this year, in Nashville, Tennessee." He paused. "Let me breathe. He left behind an estate valued at approximately $47 million. And you, Mrs. Mercer, are listed as the primary beneficiary of that estate." My paperback slid off my lap and onto the pavement. I did not pick it up. Albert Good said quietly, "There is one condition attached to the inheritance." He didn't tell me the condition right then. He said it required a proper meeting with documents. He gave me his card. He would return the following morning at 10 if I was willing. I said I was willing. He stood, picked my book up from the ground, set it gently on the bench beside me, and walked away. I sat there for a very long time. Thomas, who made me birthday cakes from scratch. Thomas, whose grave I had visited 6 times, laying flowers on ground where, apparently, no one lay at all. That man had not been in that grave. That man had been alive for 50 years. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my cot at the shelter and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what it means to discover that the foundational grief of your life, the thing that explained everything that came after, was not what you believed it to be. Not the grief, not the grave, not any of it. What does that do to 38 years of decisions you made as a widow? At 5 in the morning, I got up, went to the shelter's small common room, made instant coffee, and did what I have always done when the feelings get too large to hold all at once. I made a list, not of emotions. Facts. Fact 1. I had looked up Albert Good's firm on the shelter's shared computer before lights out. It was real. Based in Nashville. Established 1987. 4 attorneys. Fact 2. He had found me at a bench I'd been sitting at for 3 weeks. Someone had tracked me carefully. That took effort. That took intention. Fact 3. There was a condition on the inheritance. I did not yet know what it was. Fact 4. I had $12 and nowhere permanent to live. Whatever Albert Good was bringing me the next morning, I had very little to lose by hearing it fully. He arrived at 10 exactly. He brought 2 coffees from the diner across the street, which I noticed, which told me something about him. We sat at the picnic table near the library's side entrance. He laid documents out in a neat row and told me the truth. Thomas Earl Grady had left Monroe in 1975, not because of a heart attack. He had co-signed a loan for a cousin that collapsed badly, and found himself owing money to men who were not patient about such things. He was 31 years old. He was frightened. And instead of coming home and telling me, instead of facing it together, he had run. He had allowed the story of his death to take hold because it was easier than the truth. Albert Good said this plainly, and did not apologize on Thomas's behalf. Thomas had moved to Nashville, spent years in construction under the name Tom Gray, built a small contracting company, made careful investments over decades, and grown quietly wealthy. Never remarried. He had kept, on his bedside table for the rest of his life, a photograph of me taken on our wedding day, and a handwritten note that said simply, Evie, 1972. The condition of the inheritance was this. I would need to verify my identity as his original wife and legal spouse at the time of his leaving, provide original documents from our marriage, and appear at a formal probate hearing in Nashville within 60 days. I looked at the papers on that cold picnic table. I thought about my cot. I thought about Franklin's hand waving me away like an inconvenience. "I will do it," I said. Albert Good nodded as if he had expected no different answer. The documents I needed were in a plain brown cardboard box in Marcus's Atlanta garage, a box I had asked him to keep during the divorce with the instruction, "Evelyn, personal, keep safe." Marcus drove up to get me the next morning without asking a single unnecessary question. That is Marcus, always steady. The box was in the back corner, behind a lawnmower and 2 bicycles. I opened it on the garage floor with Marcus watching from the doorway, being careful not to hover. Inside, a marriage certificate, June 8, 1972. A small envelope of photographs. Thomas and me outside the chapel, squinting in the afternoon light. Thomas in the backyard holding a potted plant he'd bought for our anniversary. 3 letters he'd written me from Birmingham the summer before he disappeared. Funny and warm and signed, "Always your Thomas." And at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of tissue paper, a small silver button. It had come off his good jacket on the morning of our first anniversary. He'd said he'd sew it back on later. Later had never come. I held that button in my palm and took a slow breath and did not allow myself anything more than that. Marcus said from the doorway, "Mom, what's going on?" So I told him, not everything, but enough. I watched his face move through surprise, disbelief, and then something complicated. A son processing the fact that his father had been alive his entire life without once making himself known. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then, "What do you want to do?" "I want to go to Nashville," I said, "and I want what Thomas meant for me to have." He nodded slowly. "I'm coming with you." I told him he had work and children and a life. He said, "Mom, stop talking. I'm coming." The probate attorney in Nashville was Raymond Wells. Short, deliberate, precise, wire-rimmed glasses, the habit of reading everything twice before speaking about it. He went through my documents with methodical focus. Marriage certificate, photograph, photographs, letters. He photographed everything and explained the formal hearing would be scheduled within 3 weeks. Other parties? I repeated when he mentioned the phrase. He looked at me over his glasses. Mr. Grady had a son from a relationship in the late 1980s. His name is Calvin Grady, 49 years old, lives here in Nashville. Raymond paused. He was not named in the will. I sat with that. Thomas had a son who'd grown up with Thomas present, or at least nearby, while Marcus had grown up without a father because Thomas had run from what frightened him. Has he been told about the estate? Yes, said Raymond. Approximately 2 weeks before we located you. 2 weeks. I looked at Marcus. He was looking at the wall. 2 weeks of knowing gave a person time to plan. Calvin Grady called me 4 days later. His voice was smooth on the surface, but underneath it, the way a pot sounds just before it boils. We met at a coffee shop in the Germantown neighborhood. Marcus wanted to come. I told him no. You learn more about a person when there is nothing between you and them. Calvin was large, broad-shouldered, like Thomas had been in old photographs. He had Thomas's wide forehead and darker coloring. He'd brought a woman named Sherry who sat very straight in her chair and did not smile. Calvin had ordered coffee before I arrived and did not offer to get me anything. I took care of my father for the last 4 years, he said before I had fully sat down. Every doctor appointment, every medication, every bad night. I was there twice a week, and he left me nothing. Not his house, not his savings, not even his tools. I said, I hear that must have meant a great deal to him. He shook his head. The money should have gone to his actual present family, not a woman he walked away from 50 years ago who didn't even know he was alive. I kept my face still. You believe you should have been named in the will? I believe I earned it. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice dropping to something deliberate. I'd like you to think about a voluntary arrangement before the hearing. Clean split. Half and half. No contest. No complications. Everyone walks away with something substantial. And if I say no, the smoothness thinned. Then this gets much harder for everyone. There were things about my father's last years that a formal hearing is going to surface. Things about his state of mind, his memory, his capacity. I don't want to do that to his memory, but I will if I have to. I looked at him steadily. Let me think about it, I said. I had no intention of thinking about it, but I had just learned exactly what he planned to do if I refused, which was precisely what I needed to know. I returned to the hotel and told Raymond everything. He was quiet while I spoke. When I finished, he said, the cognitive decline argument is common in contested probate cases. In this case, it is specifically contradicted by documented medical records. Thomas's physician, Dr. Carolyn Ash, 8 years his doctor, board certified in internal medicine, affiliated with Vanderbilt University Medical Center, had already submitted a written statement confirming that Thomas had been fully cognitively competent throughout the period in which his will was written and all 3 of its updates made. The last update, 16 months before his death, witnessed by Raymond, Thomas's accountant, and Dr. Ash herself. Calvin's argument would not survive contact with that testimony. I sent word through Raymond. I was declining the settlement offer. Then I waited to see what Calvin would do. It came in stages. 3 days after I declined, Marcus received a phone call from an unknown Nashville number. A man claiming to be a journalist doing background research asked Marcus several questions, specifically about my mental health and my memory in recent years. Marcus said, my mother is sharp as a tack, and ended the call. He told me over dinner that evening. He was trying to stay calm. He was not entirely succeeding. The man had also asked whether I had ever shown signs of being easily influenced by outside parties. Mom, Marcus said across the restaurant table, these people are building something. I know, I said. Let them build. What they build, we will address. Raymond filed a formal notation with the probate court documenting the contact and its apparent purpose. Into the official record, it went. Then my hotel room was searched. I discovered it the way I always discover things, because I am the person who notices where things are, because I have spent my life being the one responsible for knowing. My travel documents and original papers were in Raymond's office safe, but other things in the room had been moved. My comb at a different angle, a book repositioned, the zipper on my suitcase not where I leave it, nothing taken, just examined. I photographed every item before I touched anything. Then I called Raymond. Then I called the hotel manager. The keycard access log showed an entry during a 2-hour window that afternoon, a card registered to a guest on another floor. Raymond filed a police report that evening. The hotel provided documentation to the Davidson County detective assigned to the matter, Detective Renee Morrison, 14 years on the force, who took the keycard log and my photographs and said, in the flat tone of someone who has heard too many "I didn't do anything wrong" stories, we'll be in touch with the registered guest. Raymond arranged for me to move to a different hotel the following morning, under a different account name, smaller, less visible. 2 documented incidents, now sitting in the formal record, connected to Calvin's campaign. Calvin's formal contestation arrived through his attorney, a man named Douglas Pratt, efficient and expensive looking. The document claimed Thomas had experienced cognitive decline in his final 2 years, impairing his judgment, that Calvin's years of caregiving constituted a recognized dependency relationship under Tennessee estate law, and that the will as written did not reflect Thomas's true wishes. It was, Raymond told me with the measured tone he used for most things, a serious-sounding document built on an argument that was going to collapse the moment Dr. Ash's medical testimony entered the room. But serious-sounding documents still require time, and while we were attending to Calvin's formal contestation, he was attending to other things. 9 days before the scheduled hearing, Marcus called me from Atlanta. I could hear in his voice voice that he was managing something carefully. A woman had come to his workplace. She had spoken to his office manager and claimed to be doing research for an estate verification process, asking whether Marcus had ever expressed concerns about his mother's mental capacity or her ability to make large financial decisions. His office manager, who had known Marcus for 11 years, told the woman to leave. Then she told Marcus immediately. Marcus kept his voice steady, telling me this. Underneath it was the sound of a son holding himself together out of love. I stayed steady on the phone. I told him frightened people press harder when they know they are losing. I told him to document everything. I called Raymond the moment I got off with Marcus. He added the workplace visit to the formal record. The pattern was now documented and clear. Calvin had retained operatives to contact witnesses, search my personal belongings, and construct a narrative about my competence. Every single action was now sitting in the legal record of this case. Raymond had also quietly identified something in Calvin's own history. As co-signatory on 2 of Thomas's bank accounts during the final 2 years, a standard caregiving arrangement on the surface, the account activity showed a pattern of transfers that Raymond described, in his very careful way, as worth examining. Not yet in front of a judge, but documented and ready. Calvin called me directly 11 days before the hearing. The smooth control was gone. What replaced it was pressure. Evelyn, he said, I want to try to handle this differently. I think we both want to honor my father. He used the word clear about Thomas's wishes. Interesting, given that his entire legal argument rested on Thomas not having been clear. I filed that away. I understand you spent years beside your father, I said, but I cannot change what he decided. Then he said, I have things I haven't brought forward yet. Things about the kind of wife you were before he left. He told me things, Evelyn. Private things about what your marriage was really like. I sat quietly for a moment. Then I said, bring them to the hearing. That is the place for them. I don't want to do that to you in a public room. Then don't. But either way, I will be at that hearing and I am confident in the outcome. He was silent for several seconds. Then, you're going to regret not taking the easy way. I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation. And then, alone in my hotel room, I let the fear I had been carefully managing have its few minutes. Because it was real. Calvin had 4 years of private conversations with Thomas. He had details about our old marriage that could be shaped into something that sounded damaging, presented in the right tone in the right room. A judge might hear a son describing his father's unhappy first marriage and wonder. That was a real concern. I had it for approximately 4 minutes, and then I put it down. Because I also had something Calvin had not planned on. Raymond had found, among Thomas's personal effects, a journal, not kept regularly, the way some people write when something becomes too heavy to hold only in their head. It went back 15 years. Across its pages, in Thomas's plain, careful handwriting, my name appeared 31 times. Raymond had counted. He had written about leaving in terms that never once excused it. He had written about Marcus growing up without a father, with a grief that was plainly and entirely self-directed. And, in an entry from 2011, in that same plain handwriting, Evie deserved better than any version of the choice I made. She was a better person than I knew how to stay beside, and I have never stopped knowing that. That was not the journal of a man describing a marriage he'd been desperate to escape. That was a man who had made a terrible decision at 31 and spent 4 decades fully understanding what he had done. The morning of the hearing, I woke at 4:30 and lay in the dark. Not anxious exactly. Something more like what it feels like to stand at the edge of something and understand it is simply time to step forward. I dressed carefully. My blue dress, the one I'd worn to Marcus's college graduation. Simple. Mine. It fit me properly, and that was enough. The probate hearing was held in a room on the 4th floor of Davidson County Courthouse. Wood-paneled walls, long fluorescent lights, a high window showing a flat gray sky. Judge Irene Colby presided. Compact, precise, reading glasses, the focused expression of someone who had seen hundreds of family disputes and found very few of them surprising. I sat at the petitioner's table with Raymond. Calvin sat at the opposing table with Douglas Pratt, Sherry in the gallery, Marcus in the gallery. He had driven up from Atlanta the night before. I'd told him he didn't have to come. He was already in his seat when I arrived. Raymond walked the hearing through our documentation methodically. Albert Good testified about the estate, the process of locating me, the validity of every submitted document. Dr. Ash's medical deposition was read into the record. Thomas fully cognitively competent at every stage. No exceptions. No equivocations. Thomas's accountant gave brief, clear testimony confirming full engagement at each of the 3 will updates. Thomas's personal attorney confirmed the signing circumstances, all witnessed, all explicit, all consistent with a man who knew precisely what he intended. Then Douglas Pratt presented Calvin's case, emotionally detailed, legally fragile. He described Thomas's final years in terms of increasing confusion and memory lapses, vivid stories unsupported by a single piece of medical documentation. Then he entered into evidence a letter he said Thomas had written to Calvin approximately 3 years before his death, expressing uncertainty about the estate and a desire to provide more meaningfully for his son. The letter was handwritten. Raymond immediately requested time to examine the document. Judge Colby granted it. Raymond read it. Then he walked to the bench. Your Honor, several handwriting characteristics in this document are inconsistent with authenticated samples of Mr. Grady's handwriting across multiple confirmed sources from the same period, including his personal journal. I am requesting this exhibit be held pending forensic document examination before admission. Pratt objected. said. Overruled. The letter was held. Across the room, something in Calvin's expression shifted. Not a collapse, a tightening. He exchanged a look with Sherry in the gallery, the look of two people who had counted on something to land, watching it suspended instead. Raymond's cross-examination of Calvin was quiet, methodical, and thorough. He established the co-signatory arrangement and walked carefully through the pattern of bank transfers during those 2 years. He established that the private investigator who visited Marcus's workplace had been retained by Calvin 6 weeks before I had even been located by Albert Good, meaning Calvin had been building his case before he had any legal standing to do so. He established the keycard timeline, Detective Morrison's police report, the contact with Marcus, every piece already in the formal record, referenced now with exhibit numbers. He asked Calvin in a quiet and even voice to explain why someone in his employment had visited my son in Atlanta to question him about my mental capacity. Calvin said it was routine, background research. Raymond asked him to define routine. Objection sustained, but the record contained everything it needed to contain. And then Calvin did what people do when they have held something for too long and the container finally cracks. He turned in his chair and looked at me directly across the room, not in response to any question, just into the air of that room. She is a stranger, he said. My father spent 4 years telling me about his life, and she was not part of any of it. I was there. Every week, every appointment, every bad night, she was nowhere. She gets everything and I get nothing. That is not what my father wanted. Judge Colby looked up from her papers. That remark is not responsive to any question before you, Mr. Grady. He kept going, looking at me. I was there. She was nowhere. Mr. Grady, Judge Colby's voice carried more weight than its volume suggested. You will confine your remarks to questions asked by counsel. Pratt rose and put a hand on Calvin's arm. Calvin sat back. His breathing was uneven. Sherry in the gallery had gone completely still. In the silence that followed, I kept my hands folded on the table and looked at nothing in particular. I thought about Thomas's journal, the entry from 2014 near the end. Marcus grew up without a father because of what I did. That boy deserved better. Evie deserved better. I wrote a will that says what I was never brave enough to say aloud. I hope it reaches her. I hope it is not too late for it to mean something. That was not a man whose mind had slipped. That was a man saying, with the only voice he had left, what he had been unable to say for 50 years. The forensic document examination took 12 days. The report was detailed, technical, and arrived at one clear conclusion. The letter was not consistent with Thomas Earl Grady's handwriting as established across 17 authenticated reference samples from the same period. The ink had been applied within the previous 9 months. Thomas had been dead for months before that ink touched paper. The letter was a forgery. Douglas Pratt formally withdrew from Calvin's representation within 3 days of the forensic report. Raymond told me, without elaboration, that attorney withdrawal at that stage of proceedings was a significant professional signal. Calvin sought new representation. 2 firms declined. A third took a preliminary meeting and also declined. The probate hearing reconvened for its final session 4 weeks after the first. Calvin appeared with a newly retained attorney, who had agreed only to represent him in the closing session on a very limited basis. The attorney said very little. The medical testimony stood uncontested. The forgery was in the record. The hotel entry, the contact with Marcus, the workplace visit, all formally noted, all unrebutted. Judge Irene Colby did not take long. The estate documentation was complete. The legal standing was clear. The will was consistent, witnessed, and competently expressed. The only challenge to my standing had rested on a document that failed forensic examination and a verbal argument unsupported by a single medical record. She ruled in my favor. $47 million. The estate of Thomas Earl Grady passed to Evelyn Rose Grady, the name I quietly reclaimed in the relevant documents, as the lawfully and explicitly named beneficiary per the clear and documented wishes of the deceased. I signed the final papers in Raymond's office that same afternoon. My hand did not tremble. Marcus was beside me. When I signed the last page, he put his hand over mine for a moment and said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. The legal aftermath for Calvin moved with the steady, unhurried pace of formal systems. Submitting a forged document in a probate proceeding is a felony in Tennessee under fraud upon the court statutes. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation. The bank account transfers during his 2 years as co-signatory were referred to a separate financial review. Sherry retained her own attorney within a week of the final ruling. Apparently, she had not been told about the forged letter before it was submitted. I had no particular need to verify that. The investigators Calvin had retained were under scrutiny for the hotel entry and the contact with Marcus. Those actions had crossed lines that courts take seriously. Franklin, back in Monroe, heard about the estate the way such things travel in cities of a certain size. Louise told me he had called his brother and been overheard saying, in a tone Louise described as less generous than the words themselves, Evelyn always was smarter than she let on. His girlfriend Darlene, from what Louise could observe, became very interested in the Burwood Drive property and Franklin's financial future. I did not call Franklin. I felt nothing when I thought of him. Not anger. Something much quieter than anger. A clear indifference. Like looking at a photograph of a house you once rented and feeling nothing stronger than the memory that you had once been there and that you were now somewhere else entirely. I stayed in Nashville. This surprised me at first, and then it didn't. I found an apartment in a quiet neighborhood near Centennial Park. Morning light came through the windows in a way that felt like permission. It was the first home I had ever chosen entirely for myself, without reference to what anyone else needed from it. I bought a sewing chair with proper back support, the kind I had always wanted. I bought a kitchen table with 4 chairs because I intended to have people sit at it. I called Marcus and told him to put his boys in music lessons, whatever instrument they wanted, and not to worry about the cost. "Mom, that's too much," he said. "Marcus, I missed 50 years of Thomas's money growing quietly in Tennessee while I was hemming other people's trousers for $11 an hour. I think we can afford music lessons." He laughed. I hadn't heard him laugh like that in a long time. I laughed too. Spring arrived in Nashville with dogwood blossoms and warm afternoons and the kind of light that comes after a long, hard winter and makes everything feel slightly more possible than the month before. I enrolled in a quilting class at the community center near the park, something I had always wanted to do, but never had the time or the permission that I now understood I had always been able to give myself. I joined a Thursday evening reading group at the library. A woman I'd met in the waiting room of the hotel diner during those long pre-hearing weeks, June Watkins, 71, retired Davidson County Circuit Court clerk, sharp and warm and unbothered by silence, came with me to the first meeting and declared the group acceptable. We walked to the Bluebird Diner most mornings and ate breakfast and talked and let the hours take their own shape. Small things. But I have learned by 73 that small things are the actual substance of a life. The large events are just the frame. Albert Good mentioned at our final meeting to close the estate proceedings that Thomas had left a sealed letter, marked simply, "For Evelyn, to be opened when she is ready." I carried it in my coat pocket for 4 days. On the 5th morning, I made good coffee, sat in my kitchen chair by the window where the light came in best, and opened it. 5 pages in Thomas's plain, careful script. He explained 1975 without excuse and without asking to be understood. He named what he had done plainly: fear, selfishness, cowardice. He used that word himself. He wrote about Marcus with a grief that was entirely and fully self-directed. He wrote about watching from a distance, never close enough to make it right. At the very end, he wrote, "Evie, I do not ask you to forgive me. I ask only that what I am leaving behind reaches you and does something useful. You were always the stronger one. You always were." I folded the letter carefully and put it in the brown cardboard box beside the marriage certificate and the silver button and the wedding photograph. Thomas and me outside the chapel, squinting in the afternoon light, young and broke and not yet knowing what was coming. Then I closed the box and went to meet June, because it was Thursday, and the reading group met at 7, and the morning was still full of ordinary hours that belonged entirely to me.